I'm going to move on and talk about a few things today, lecture-wise, that are kind of important overall. Of course, I'm going to get into the later part of kind of like the rise of the British Empire. Most I'll kind of talk the Stuart Hanover period a little bit today. Then I'll also kind of lead into the later dynasties, like into the Windsor dynasty. I'll kind of get a little bit into that also as well. So from last time, I had talked about, of course, how they had, the British had the English Civil War break out. And then I was getting up to like the period of Oliver Cromwell, how they had the Commonwealth period, that Republican period that they had briefly for a while, for a few years. And then I got into, we started talking about the Restoration, how the Stuart dynasty was brought back in, which happened, of course, in the year 1660, when the Stuarts were restored to power. And they'll be in power, by the way, until 1714. I think we kind of already talked about some of those rulers that come in later. Charles II, who we'll first talk about, of course, today. James II, his brother. Also talked about William and Mary. I think I kind of mentioned about them. And then I'll also get later into talking about Queen Anne, who was, of course, the last Stuart monarch they had. Of course, here's an image, of course, showing King Charles II on the left there. There's, of course, a famous, like maybe one book, if you want to look at that. It was written, I think, at one point, on King Charles's reign overall. But Charles was known as the Merry Monarch. That's one of his nicknames he's often called. That was a nickname that a lot of the British called him later because the fact that that time period was more or less a happier time period in British history. And that's, I think, because of the fact that they had gotten rid of the Puritans. Like Puritanism had kind of taken over the country, and so they were kind of happy to go back to that period in British history, and things are more liberal, more looser. And he was known for a very loose court, which is true about that. Charles II was notorious for having a lot of mistresses, believe it or not. And he had this wife who was actually a Portuguese Catholic, which I think was semi-controversial at the time. But they apparently didn't have any children that survived, for some reason. And so he had all these illegitimate children that he had through various mistresses, but none of them could get the throne. Of course, this later creates kind of a controversy I'll get to later, the fact that he has to give the throne to his brother, who is Catholic. So we'll get to that later and talk about that. But that is one thing that's very controversial about that. And they think some of these Stuarts, like Charles and his brother James, were kind of pro Catholic somewhat. Here's kind of image of the Stuarts returning, of course, to Britain in 1660. Of course, the Stuarts had been in exile for years. They returned to the country, after the Commonwealth period ended, and the Cromwells were pretty much taken out of power at that point. Anyway, I'll talk about some of the events that happened under Charles that were very famous. I'll kind of get first and talk about the Great Plague of London that happened between 1665 and 1666. That and the Great Fire, those two things are probably some of the two most famous events that really happened under King Charles II. And the Great Plague of London, if you know much about it, was considered one of the last major outbreaks of bubonic plague that happened in Europe. I think the plague kind of is a bunch of outbreaks up to like the 19th century that they have. But I think it's considered one of the last famous ones that you hear about. And if you know about the Great Plague, or the bubonic plague, of course, often later called the Black Death or the so-called Black Plague, it was a type of plague that was, as you can see, spread by rats from rat fleas. They, of course, talked about the famous bacterium that really started it, which was, of course, it was called Yersinia pestis, which was a type of bacterium spread through rat fleas. When they bit you, it would give you this Plague, which had all kinds of symptoms to it, which, of course, one of the most famous symptoms, was the famous bobos that people would get on their body, which were swellings of the lymph nodes, swell up of blood and pus, and it had a ring around it. And anyway, bubonic plague, by the way, was one of the worst plagues, in history. I think they think at one point the bubonic plague may have killed as many as like 100 to 200 million people worldwide. With the 14th century, they had the so-called Black Death in the 14th century. That was considered one of the worst outbreaks, of course, in history. They think in England, though, that especially London, that about, close to 25% of the actual population died within like a period of like something like 18 months. So 100,000 or more, I think, is believed to be estimated about how many people died from it. And it got to the point where it got so bad that they had to quarantine people. And so we know much about quarantining, which we kind of know about that because of COVID. You have sometimes quarantine for like 14 days. Well, traditionally, a quarantine was actually 40 days. That's where the term came from originally. And so they'd shut you up in your house for 40 days, and they actually would put a mark on your house, like on the door, like usually a cross or something like that, saying that you had this plague. They're not, opening up until 40 days later. And of course, if you know about the Great Plague of London, it of course led to famous English nursery rhymes, which of course one of the most famous you may have heard about is the Ring Around the Rosie, right? I think everybody's sang that one and maybe gone around in a circle, kids or whatever. And that actually, the actual rhyme goes back to the actual plague back in the 17th century. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes to ashes, we all fall down. So yeah, the ring around the rosy, they got a red rash around the mouth, but they also got usually a ring around the bobo also as well. A lot of people would put flowers in their masks. Like they wear masks to try to, thinking that they smelled good things, that they wouldn't get the plague. They smelled, I guess, the dead and all that. Violent sneezing associated with the plague, and things like that. But ash to ashes, that part, of course, they would burn all the bodies. Got to the point where there was so many dead, they just burned all the bodies. If we all fall down, everybody's dying, of course, with that. So it's kind of like very Macrobee, that kind of thing with that. They do think, though, that the Great Plague of London, they think what helped it to die off was the Great Fire of London that came next in 1666. And the Great Fire of London was considered to be one of Britain's worst catastrophes that ever happened in the history of the city of London in the UK. And happened in September of 1666 over like a 3-4 day period. It burned, by the way, most of the original majority of the medieval London that going back to Roman times, especially within the medieval Roman walls, I guess, that were there, ancient walls. But it burned down at one point over 13,000 buildings, and I think over 100-something thousand people or more were made refugees during that time period. And it is considered one of the probably the worst of the two most disasters that have ever hit, of course, London. The other one we'll get to later when we get to World War II. The British had the Blitz, about that during World War II, where Nazi Germany, under Hitler, bombed London and other, British cities. And so they called it the Blitz later. That's considered the other disaster that, of course, happened to London. It destroyed a lot of parts of that. I think killed more people, they think, than the Great Fire of London. But one of the weird things about, the Great Fire of London is that even though it was such an awful catastrophe, the amount of deaths associated with it, they're not sure. It doesn't seem to be as many deaths as they think, basically. But you can see how it spread. You can see it actually started near the London Bridge, right here in this location. You can see it spread to the rest of the city, burning out most of the old part of the old city right here. It even went outside the old London walls over here. Didn't really reach like London Tower and all that, and Whitehall, where the royal family was and all that, in their palaces. They were kind of spared. But the weird thing about, the Great Fire of London is that it was an accident. They think it started in actually a bakery that was in what is Pudding Lane in England, in London. And this Thomas Fariner, that apparently was a baker that worked for the government. And I think he baked mostly bread for, I want to say, the Royal Navy, I think is what it was. Anyway, a fire started on the morning, I think, of September 2nd, broke out from there. And so it was considered an accident. Although there was this deal where there was a French watchmaker named, I think his name was Robert Hubert, and he claimed that he started on purpose or something like that. But it turned out to be, it was just a false confession, that kind of deal. But the Great Fire of London, Great Plague of London, that obviously helped to reduce, the population of London. But after the Industrial Revolution started, London expanded, quadrupled in size or more. Of course, the rebuilding of London actually was more better. Of course, after that, better constructed and all that. So anyway, kind of talking about some of those events that happened under, King Charles that were famous. I did want to talk about a few other events that did happen under Charles. I'll kind of mention a few more things about him. Then I'll kind of move on to talk about his brother James as well. There were some assassination plots to try to kill Charles II and his brother James. And they had this thing called the Popish Plot in 1678, where this man and maybe some other people were kind of involved. They're not sure exactly, but they would think it was some kind of anti-Catholic conspiracy that came out. That maybe, I think Titus Oates, he was known as the Liar, and he was kind of creating a lot of hysteria about Catholics, wanting to kill Charles and his brother James, the Duke of York. And so it caused mass hysteria in the country for like several years. I think Titus Oates was eventually put on trial for it and was imprisoned. And so people were kind of concerned that there were basically Catholics throughout the country or Jesuits that wanted to basically kill them. There was another plot too that was interesting called the Rye House Plot that happened a few years later, 1683. Where they think some members of Parliament and others that were didn't really like, Charles and James because they saw them as too pro-Catholic, and so they were going to try to kill the two, like murder them, and maybe put somebody on the throne more Protestant. And I think what happened was there was a story where the two, Charles and James, were going to watch some kind of horse races, I think. And they were going to murder them from a rye house that was nearby. And anyway, apparently they didn't go to the races. They got canceled for some. I think it was some kind of fire in a town, something like that. They had to cancel it, and so the plot didn't really work out. But several members of Parliament were arrested for it. William Russell, Thomas Armstrong, who were actually MPs in Parliament, were actually later implicated and executed. Even the Sheriff of London, his name was Henry Cornish, was later arrested and executed as well. So there's a lot of uneasiness about Charles and James. And it got to the point where Parliament even passed some acts, like in the 1670s, the so-called Test Acts. You may have heard about this, that came out. And these were actually these acts where basically what it said was that if you were going to be in the military or in the government of Great Britain, you had to take an oath to serve. And what the oath said basically was that you weren't Catholic, that you don't believe in like the Lord's Supper with transubstantiation, which Catholics believe. And so you had to take this oath, basically. So a lot of people were, cut out. They weren't able to, serve in the government. Now, I think the idea was to try to maybe exclude Charles's brother James from getting the throne. And Parliament went further. They had these so-called exclusion bills that came out in 1679, where they were trying to prevent James, the Duke of York, from becoming king because he's Catholic. But they never were able to pass it, get it passed and all that. So what happened was in 1685, you got, of course, Charles's brother comes to the throne, of course, who I'll talk about next, which is James II, who you see a picture of right here. He comes in and he becomes, of course, the ruler, James II. He's the one that New York is named after, like New York City, of course, today, because at one point he actually owned the lands where New York, the colony of New York, was at one point. I think he controlled New Jersey as well. He's the last Catholic ruler that the British have. He later gets overthrown because of the glorious revolution that happens 2-3 years later. And what happened to basically cause this was, well, at first it wasn't that bad when he came in. There's a lot of tensions about him, King James II, that are kind of a problem. James, by the way, kind of a few things about him. He favored religious toleration towards Catholics. That's one thing that he tried to push in the country, which, by the way, was met with a lot of hostility. Those people didn't trust Catholics in Britain. So what happened before, I guess, going back to Queen Mary. Also, James was also very pro-divine right. He thought that the king should have more power instead of Parliament. So this created a lot of tensions. But at first they were okay because what happened was when he came in, he had these two daughters that were going to be next in line to the throne. His first wife was Anne Hyde, who he was married to for 11 years before she died in 1671. But she had two children, later Queen Mary II and also Queen Anne, who were both Protestant, by the way. That's okay, So they figure he's going to be gone and then they'll come in at that point. But what happened was in 1673, prior to this, he had remarried. He married this woman named Mary of Modena, who is also known as Mary Beatrice, who, by the way, was from Italy. And she was very devout Catholic, by the way. And so apparently they believed that James had converted to Catholicism sometime in either 1668 or 1669. And the problem was in June of 1688, he had a son named James Francis Edward Stuart, later called the Old Pretender. I think somebody called James III, those that kind of supported him, who he gets born. And so this creates a lot of problems with him and, of course, Parliament, because now he's Catholic. He's a Catholic, heir that he's got that he can put on the throne. So this creates a lot of tension at that point. Well, what happens in Parliament, they decide that the best bet would be just to replace him. They put another, monarch in power at that point. So a bunch of members of Parliament decide to invite over William of Orange, who was a nephew of James II. He was married to Mary, who was basically the daughter I told you about, James II. They're living in the Netherlands. William of Orange is the ruler of the Netherlands, what we call the Dutch state there. And by the way, those two were first cousins that had married each other. And so they decided to basically, put them on the throne instead. And what happens is they send him a letter. The letter's got different names, or the common name they usually call it is the Invitation to William letter. But a lot of people call it the Immortal Seven letter because there were 7 members of Parliament that put their names on it or signed it, basically, when they sent it to William. It basically said, if you come over with your army, we'll put you in power. You can co-rule with your cousin and wife, Mary. And so that's what happened. And so what occurs is in the winter, like November of 1688, William comes over, crosses the English Channel with his army. And what it does, it forces James at that point to flee the country. He basically decides that they don't want him. Nobody is going to back him. A lot of the military wouldn't back him either. And so basically James flees to France, to Louis XIV, by the way, who is his cousin, his first cousin, and all that. So that ends up causing a bloodless coup that the British later referred to it as being called the Glorious Revolution. So you get this exchange of power. Well, where what happens eventually is that James is replaced by William and Mary that come in. You see here in that image, William III, and of course Mary II, where I told you were cousins. They're married to each other, and so that basically is going to end up leading to them taking power. Now I'll talk about a little bit later about they have this thing called the Bill of Rights that Parliament's going to adopt at that point. After this period, you're going to see Britain go more towards a constitutional monarchy. I'll get to that in a second, but let me talk about one other thing that also happens at the same time as well. Now, as basically James is thrown off the throne, there's this thing that you may have heard about that kind of starts afterwards, which is the so-called Jacobite movement that follows, with James being ousted from Great Britain at that point. Also called Jacobitism is the other name that they refer to it as being called. And Jacobitism is a movement that was very popular in the late 17th, in the early 18th century. It was a movement to basically put the House of Stuart monarchs back on the throne that were related to James II and his direct descendants, most of the Catholic ones, of course. James II and his son, one that I told you about, named James, and then James had a son named Charles, I'll get to later, that were there. And it sparked a bunch of these so-called Jacobite rebellions that were all throughout England, like Scotland, mostly in Ireland. They had, there was a ton of them that they had, these numerous Jacobite rebellions. They had the Williamite War, they had in Ireland and also in Scotland. They had the risings that happened in 1715. There was one in 1719. There was one in 1745. They're usually called risings, is what they called them, Scotland and Ireland. They usually don't have the 17 on it. They'll say rising of 1715. Actually, rising of 15, the rising of 45, names like that that were there. And I know there was an attempt in 1690, which is very famous, where James II actually invaded with some backing from Louis XIV to try to get him back on the throne. So-called Williamite War, because they were fighting whether they keep William III on the throne or James. And William's forces were able to defeat James II near the River Boyne on July 1st, so-called Battle of the Boyne. The Irish were mad as hell that James II didn't support him in all that. I think they called James II James the shit, or shite, I guess was how they said it, basically. They also had the Old Pretender. He was also involved in the Jacobite risings, rebellions as well. The so-called Old Pretender, the son of James II, he would try to take the throne also as well. It happened under King George I. And I think later on George II, they also tried to take the throne as well. And then he had a son as well named Charles Edward Stuart that came, the third one that tried to get the throne of the Stuarts. He was famously involved in the Rising of 45, where his forces in what is Scotland tried to basically invade and maybe try to take the throne back. And Charles Edward Stuart was later known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, they called him. And eventually, though, they were defeated. Battle of Culloden in 1746. And Culloden was actually one of the last major battles that was actually fought on British soil. So pretty much after that, no more Jacobites, came after that to try to, take the throne. So Jacobite movement was kind of a brief time period, like I said, between the 17th and 18th centuries. And so, yeah, the Catholic, Stuarts, they never could get the throne back and all that. Now, let me talk about for a few minutes one of the big things that happened, of course, under William and Mary. That's pretty important. And we have what they call the Bill of Rights that came out afterwards. That, of course, in 1689, what it did was it allowed William and Mary to reign as co-rulers. They were joint monarchs. They were equals. They were on the throne of Britain, but it wasn't just that. It also created a constitutional monarchy, which Britain went to afterwards. And so afterwards, the monarch becomes more of a head of state rather than a monarch that has a lot more powers than before. And so the Bill of Rights was, of course, it did several things, not just, created this, constitutional system that we're talking about, but it limited the monarch's power, the amount of power they could have on the throne, which the monarch still has some powers, but it's limited. Very little things that they can do anymore. They're not quite like a figurehead, but they almost are. They're going that way. But the big thing that the Bill of Rights did in 1689 was it adopted various rights that would be there for all Englishmen. Later women, of course, but traditionally, men at that point. It also banned Catholics on the throne. So basically, like I said, James II was the last, Catholic to be on the British throne. These are kind of some things that was, I'll kind of list for you that were in it, but you can see here, these are basic rights that were put in the Bill of Rights. Only Parliament can draft laws and raise taxes. So before, remember, going back to previous kings like Charles I, there had been attempts to actually do that by a monarch. So now only Parliament can do that, can control that method of creating laws and even revenue. Of course, it talks about the ideas of free speech, right to petition the crown, things like that. No quartering of troops, especially in peacetime. No posting of excessive bail. Those are things you see also in the United States Constitution as well. Also, here's some other things too. No imprisonment without charge. So there's got to be some reason why, they have to basically put you in prison. They can't suspend your habeas corpus rights. The court has to prove why you're in prison. I think the old saying in Latin is, show me the body, show me, what I've done to be, put in prison overall. Also, the monarch, it said too, which is true in the Bill of Rights, the monarch is not above the law. So like everybody else, he's a citizen of Britain. And so he must also follow the rule of law. Now, I think the problem was they thought James hadn't, things like that as well. All citizens have a right to trial by jury. That was another thing they put in there, which, was very important as well. Also, the Bill of Rights, of course, is something that is very influential, of course, in the United States. That's one thing that's very famous about it. The Bill of Rights heavily influenced the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which some people call it the U.S. Bill of Rights or United States Bill of Rights we have here today. And a lot of these ideas that went into the English, the British Bill of Rights are kind of similar to some of the ideas that we have also as well. They do think that, we'll talk about him later, but there was this man named John Locke. I'll kind of get more into later when I get into the Age of Enlightenment, which he was involved in later. But John Locke, who was a very famous English philosopher, was instrumental in developing a lot of these theories that went into the Bill of Rights. He had a series of essays that he wrote around 1689 that was called Two Treatises on Government. And it talked about some of these ideas about contract theory of government. And he outlines a lot of ideas, like the idea that the government's there to protect people's life, liberty, and property. And that's something that's real instrumental influencing British ideas of government and also later American ideas. We'll get to it. I'll get to that later. I won't talk about that today as much into John Locke, but we'll talk about him later when I get more into the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason. Now, I did want to talk about for a few minutes about also Queen Anne that later rules. as well, as you can see in this image here. There's Queen Anne. She's the last actual Stuart monarch to reign, of course, 1702 to 1714. And the problem with her was she died without any heirs that could get the throne. I don't know what it was with the Stuarts, but they obviously didn't have enough heirs there to continue the dynasty. And of course, she had all the Catholic ones that couldn't get the throne and all that as well. She's the sister of Queen Mary II, and so Parliament responded with an act to fix this problem, to make sure that they have a monarch on the throne. And so they have this act called in 1701 that's known as the Act of Settlement. And what it did was it decided who would get the British throne. And it wouldn't go to a Stuart, which was somewhat controversial, of course, at the time. It would go to the House of Hanover, some cousins that are in Germany, George of Hanover, George Ludwig, I think his name, and they were a Protestant royal family. That I think now it's later in Prussia, Germany later. But the reason why Hanover got the throne was because of the fact that the Catholic Stuarts couldn't get it. And so it passed up, like, I think over 50 people at one point were passed up. And they actually were going to give it to this woman named Sophia of Hanover. She was going to get the throne, but she died before she could get the throne because Queen Anne outlived her. And so it went to her son instead, George. So he got the throne basically. And so that's how, basically the Hanover dynasty ends up on the throne. Here's, by the way, an image showing you how George got the throne. You can see down here. You've got Mary, Mary. They got Queen Anne and Mary II over here. William outlived Mary, basically, and then Queen Anne came in. Now you see over here, you got these Stuarts over here that could have got the throne, but because of the Bill of Rights, what happened with the Glorious Revolution, they couldn't get the throne. So you had to go all the way back to King James here, with Anne in Denmark right there. And so George I was basically a great-grandson. Yeah, great-grandson of King James. So that's how he ended up, of course, on the throne. Now, there's one other thing, of course, that's very famous that happened to Queen Anne I did want to mention about as well. They had this thing called the Acts of Union that came out in the early 1700s. I think around 1709 it becomes official or whatever. But anyway, what occurred was that England and Scotland were joined as this United Kingdom afterwards officially, which I think going back to King James, they had already talked about this already, where King James I had become one of the first kings of Great Britain. And this kind of made it official between the two kingdoms being united together. And so it became known as United Kingdom of Great Britain. Later, they had another one, I think it's 1800 they have, which is the Acts of Union in 1801, where they have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, where they later combined Ireland with it. And so because of it, they adopted a new flag to represent this new de facto state they created. And so that's how you end up with the flag of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, is you get this flag where they combine all the actual traditional flags of the actual kingdoms that were united. So what they did was they took the actual flags of England and Scotland, which you can see here, they combined it as one. St. George's Cross, the St. Andrew's Cross together. And so that's how you end up with this flag in the 18th century. Then when they had the Acts of Union, where they combined Ireland with Great Britain, Scotland and England, they had the St. Patrick's Cross also as well. So that's why you end up with that flag you have today, which is the modern flag they have now. And of course, today, St. Patrick's Cross is really just Northern Ireland now, because later the Republic of Ireland, which was formed later in the 20th century, they repealed it and broke away and all that. And looks like Sophia's joining us, and also Sydney also as well. So anyway, so yeah, that's how the flags end up coming out. Of course, later you can see here in these images right here, the flags are used later for areas of the British Empire they control at one point. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada, British Caribbean. You can see in Africa they used it in various colonies. They had, pretty much the British Raj when Britain controlled India, British China. So all these different flags being used, of course, as well. So all those are kind of adopted later, of course, by the British, using that flag, and pretty much still a de facto flag used not just by the United Kingdom, but other countries still today. And Australia and New Zealand are the ones that are, of course, the most famous. All right, now also, I wanted to move on and talk about as well, get into and discuss more into some of the dynasties that have. Well, I want to get into talk a little bit about the Hanno, some of the famous rulers that are, of course, part of those dynasties that they have later. Here's kind of a list showing you the later rulers that they have of the House of Hanover that comes over from Germany, which is right here. And like I said, it starts with George I, who comes in 1714. He was like a cousin of the Stuarts. And of course, it created a lot of controversy. Like I said, they had these riots break out. I think they call it the coronation riots in 1714. A lot of people didn't like it when he came to power, George I. He'll reign until 1727. George was more of a German type ruler that came to power. I think I've got an image showing him right here. I think I've got, there he's George I. And yeah, he was more German. That was the weird thing about George. They came over, kind of went back and forth between Germany and Britain. In fact, he's the only monarch of the British, I think, was buried, I want to say, in Germany. In fact, if you know about a lot of the names, like in Britain, they have in England, the Thames River. They say that's part of why it's named that way, because he couldn't pronounce it Thames. So I think that's how he originally said it. He kept saying the Thames, because it's German, and so the name stuck. The kingdom is the Thames. But George started a period in British history that's called the Georgian Era, where you got all these rulers named George. George I, George II, George III, George IV. They even include William IV in there as well in the Georgian Era. I think it's like the son the son and his son. George II was the son of George I, and George III, I think, was the grandson of George II. Then you got William IV later that you have as well. And one of the things that happened under George I, which is very famous, you get the rise of these political parties in Britain, the so-called Whig and Tory parties that are against each other. And Tories are more conservative type political party, and then you get the Whigs that are more liberal. And George was more liberal, and so he backed the Whigs and all that. And so you get these two opposing parties that you have, and that's where you get all these parties you got now that are in Britain today overall, where you've got the Conservative Party today, which kind of formed out of the Tories. And you have the Liberal Party now also as well, which formed out of the Whigs. But George was more in favor. And of course, the Tories were famous for their motto, which was God, Queen, and Country, which you may have heard about. That was originally going back to that, and Conservatives, of course, came in later. But the Georgian era is a very interesting period. A lot of things happen, during that time. It's like when the British Empire really starts to expand is under the Hanover dynasty. You've got all kinds of things that happen. Britain went through the industrial agricultural revolutions that made it a world power. I think Britain becomes the so-called workshop of the world. Also, you got the American and French revolutions. I know they lost the American colonies, but didn't seem to phase their empire much at all, with the United States forming. French Revolution, they later defeat Napoleon during that time. Yeah, they do have the Age of Enlightenment, the Romantic movements as well that happened, in Britain and Europe at the same time. But after that, after they defeat Napoleon, British Empire just is unstoppable, pretty much. But one thing about George I did want to mention about him, he did actually is one thing that's real famous is he put in Sir Robert Walpole. If you know about this in 1721, this started the so-called British cabinet system that they have later, where basically this controls the government with the prime minister heading up the government, and then the king or queen is just the head of the state. And so Robert Walpole, like I said, was considered the first prime minister of Great Britain. He'll reign in power from 1721 to 1742. And they think part of why George I created this prime minister was because of the fact that, like I said, he was German. He really didn't know how British government worked. And also, he didn't speak English very good. So basically, the prime minister more or less became, at first, I think, a go-between between him and the government. And eventually, the prime minister, over time, is going to gain more and more power until pretty much they're the ones that are running the state, really. And then the monarch's more almost a figurehead, but not quite. But that's kind of where the British cabinet kind of takes off from there in the 18th century. I did want to talk about also some other monarchs that were very famous. Of course, you had King George III, who will come into power overall. There, of course, George right there. Later famous for going mad, if you know about this. But yeah, George III is considered really one of the most famous monarchs, like male monarchs in British history that you have after maybe King Henry VIII. Anyway, he reigned like close to about 60 years in power. It's really under him that the British Empire begins to expand. This was because of the fact that under him, they would defeat France in numerous wars, especially the 7 Years' War, and then later the Napoleonic Wars that would follow after the French Revolution as well. Also, under him, another thing that happened was they merged Ireland into the United Kingdom. I told you about that Acts of Union that later came out, another one. They came out around 1800. And so Ireland was now part of it officially as well with the United Kingdom. They wouldn't break away until like the early 20th century when Irish independence would kind of become real popular, especially after World War I. So yeah, it's under him, like in the American history, I think everybody knows about King George and, the fact that we were fighting him in the American Revolutionary War, which has all kinds of names, the American War for Independence, where the 13 colonies broke away under George Washington, right, in the Continental Congress. So that's one thing he's very famous for, at least from our perspective. We think about that, I think, more than anything we talk about King George in the United States. But yeah, he's famous for, most people don't know about that, but he was the actual main king when they defeated Napoleon, when he was in power, of course, in the early 1800s in France as well. Why was he called Mad King George? I think that was, of course, a nickname you may have heard about that George III was known for. In the later part of his reign, he had a lot of problems, like mentally. They think he suffered from some kind of mental illness, which they think was either bipolar. I think some people think he may have had dementia as well, and like didn't know where he was. I think in the last part of his reign, he wasn't sure who he was, that kind of thing. He also suffered some kind of blood disorder called porphyria, I think it's called, and it made him go crazy or something like that. And they later made a movie about it that was real popular, known as The Madness of King George. You may have seen. And it won a bunch of Academy Awards years ago. Somebody want to check it out. It's got Helen Mirren in it. I think later plays another movie where she plays the Queen as well. But anyway, so yeah, that's King George III that you're looking at. Now, he also had later, I wanted to talk about Queen Victoria as well. I need to get into her. talk about her reign as well. She's very important, of course. Queen Victoria was the last ruler of the Hanover dynasty. She reigned from 1837 to 1901. She was a niece of William IV. If you go back to that family tree that I was showing right here, you can see that George IV, of course, was the next king after George III died. He reigned only about 10 years from 1820 to 1830. He died young, and his brother took over, William IV, who reigned only for 7 years. He died young too, 1837. And so Edward was another son of George III, and he, of course, died also apparently 1820. And so she ended up on the throne as well later. She ends up getting the throne basically as Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria is very important because they talk about the fact that under Queen Victoria, that's when really the British Empire will peak, especially in the 19th century. They always talk about the imperial century in British history, how in the 1800s, Britain's empire expanded all over the world, into Africa. They start colonizing Africa, so-called scramble for Africa, you may have heard about. They get into Asia, they get into the Pacific as well. And Queen Victoria, she's so famous, that she's got a era named after her called the Victorian Era. I think somebody call it Victorian Age occasionally. And for a long time, she was considered the longest reigning ruler in British history, like 63, 64 years, until, currently Queen Elizabeth II, is now in power. They also sometimes call it the Pax Britannica. I don't know if you heard of that too, but under her reign, that's a nickname they started calling Britain in the world at the time. That's kind of a coin off of the whole Pax Romana thing. They think that when the Romans were around, there was this peace worldwide, at least in part of like Europe, Asia, Africa. And so they think when the British Empire was in power under her and some rulers afterwards, that there was like no major wars that really broke out that were worldwide, especially from the Napoleonic era to like World War One. So you got this rising power of the British. In Britain, because of its naval power, and its, industrial output, they were able to kind of keep peace, throughout the world. Here's, by the way, she had her actual consort, of course, was Prince Albert, who, by the way, was from Germany. He was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which was actually these two little small states that was in northern Germany. Anyway, she married him, and so the children afterwards starts a new dynasty named after the husband. So they usually do, and so the dynasty afterwards was called the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which later was also called Windsor, which they changed the name during World War One and all that. And so I think I've got an image showing the two together. Right here's kind of a painting of what they look like. But it's interesting how I think this is considered. I want to say the first two, I guess monarch with or husband or whatever. But first picture I think ever taken, with Queen Victoria after they were married, with Prince Philip right there with her. Looks like she was kind of good looking too, back then. So anyway, one thing about Queen Victoria, which is very famous about her as well, she is known as a kind of a nickname that you may have heard about. And she's often referred to as being called the grandmother of Europe. And that's because the fact that a lot of her children, a lot of her grandchildren would end up on a lot of the thrones of Europe, like, the throne of like Germany, like the Kaisers, like Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm II was related to Queen Victoria. Also, if you know about Wilhelm, had a cousin, of course, that was on the Russian Empire's throne. which is Emperor or Tsar Nicholas II as well. So you got all these, relatives that you've got on the throne and all that. So she's so-called grandmother, of course, of Europe. You've got, like I said, these other later rulers that come in later. Like you've got the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which that's pretty much created by Victoria and Prince Philip after that point. Here afterwards, what ends up happening, you get Edward VII that comes in next. He's the next ruler that comes into power. Edward, of course, starts a new period in British history that they usually call it the so-called Edwardian era. So they think it's kind of an extension of the Victorian period that maybe even goes up to World War I, they think, as well. Got an image showing Edward right here. But Edward was often called later the Peacemaker. It's kind of a nickname they started giving him because the fact that apparently one of the things that Edward was real known for, of course, under him, was the fact that he helped to create a lot of lasting peace in the country. And kind of move this down a little bit for you. But Edward was very instrumental in making peace with France, which will kind of be later important, I guess, when World War I breaks out. And so that's why he got the name overall. He's also known for having a lot of children and grandsons that are on the throne as well. His son, George V, of course, will take the throne later. You have two grandsons that were also on the throne as well, Edward VIII and George VI. He also has a great-granddaughter that will, of course, be on the British throne later, which is Queen Elizabeth II, which is, the current ruler that we have now in power. So that's Edward VII, and he was very fashionable. He did travel throughout the world. It's something a lot of these kings start to do. And so he has a lot of influence on the world as a lead up, to later, I guess, World War I that breaks out in 1914. I'll kind of, for a few minutes, I'll kind of go into the later part of the British Empire, but I'll kind of spend talking a little bit about also some of the later rulers that come in. So you got the House of Windsor, as they start calling it later in the 1910s. Of course, House of Windsor rulers will be later George V, Edward VIII, George VI, and now currently, of course, Queen Elizabeth II. There, of course, is George V that you're looking at right there. George V was the son of Edward VII, who died in 1910, excuse me, which, by the way, was a big funeral when that happened, 1910. And George V was the king that reigned during World War I. And because of the fact that a lot of the British hated the Germans during the war, they called the Germans like Hun and things like that, the Boche, etc. And because of all the anti-German sentiments that were in the country, the royal family decided to change the name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the House of Windsor. It's done in 1917. They kind of kicked around a bunch of names. They decided to name it after Windsor Castle, which, is a very popular castle, of course, in Britain today, in England. I know the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth, that's one of her favorite residencies, if you know about that, besides Buckingham Palace. And so that's where the name Windsor evolved from. And a lot of dynasties, name their dynasty after castles. I know, like the Hohenzollern one in Prussia, Germany, it was named after a castle, also as well, as an example. So I guess they kind of copied them a little bit with that, Windsor Castle. So so that's kind of how the name, came about and all that. And so all the later rulers, they start calling it that as well. So there's under George V, by the way, going back to him. And I guess under Edward, you can see the size of the British Empire, pretty much by the early 1900s up to World War I. That's the size of the British Empire, which we talked about before. At one point, they controlled a landmass of 1/4, of the earth at one point. So you can see all the areas that they controlled You can see Africa, Asia. You can see a lot of areas that they went into and began to colonize overall. It had some impact on later as a whole. I know India was a big part of their empire, and even like Victoria was one of the first to have the title Empress or Emperor later of India. They have, but the kings have also as well. Now, some of the later rulers of the Windsors that are kind of famous, you have Edward VIII, you see on the left, and then you have George VI, of course, on the right, who were both the sons of King George, of course, V. A little bit about Edward VIII. He was on the throne in 1936, and there's a lot of controversy about him, if you know about it. He wanted to get married, but the woman that he wanted to marry was an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. And he went and married her. And so British and Parliament wasn't happy about it. I think Anglican Church wasn't happy either because she had been divorced before. And so they forced him to abdicate, which he stepped down. I guess he chose love over the throne, which I don't know if I would or not, but he did. And so I think he only reigned a little less than a year, like 10 or 11 months, and he stepped down. And so the throne went to his brother, George VI, who you see, of course, on the right. George VI, by the way, was the main king that pretty much reigned during World War II, pretty much from, I guess, the Great Depression up through World War II. And he was the king for a few years into the early part of the Cold War era as well. If you know about George VI, he was very famous for having a stammering problem, where he would give a speech and he would start stammering or stuttering and couldn't finish the speech. It was awful. He had to actually get people to help him to learn how to speak properly. And I think they made a movie about it in 2010, you may have heard about, which was called The King's Speech. And Winston Churchill, was considered one of his most famous prime ministers that reigned, of course, during his reign, especially during World War II and all that. So that's the king that kind of reigned, of course, during that time. And then George VI had, of course, a daughter later that would end up on the throne after he died in 1952. And of course, that's Queen Elizabeth II, the current ruler of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth realms right there. She's been reigning since 1952, of course, to the present. And as you know, she's the longest reigning monarch in British history. She's been reigning forever. Seems like it, I know she's been reigning before I was born. And she's 95 years old today. She's been reigning for over 69 years that she's been in power. Her son, by the way, her oldest son, which is, Charles, the Prince of Wales, he's been also waiting for the throne about the same amount of time. Because I think when she came to power, he was already born. So they say that Charles, the Prince of Wales, is considered the longest heir apparent, I think, in history. Almost 70 years has been waiting, which is crazy about that. There's a lot of controversy about that, too. She is getting pretty old. I know her mother lived to be like about 101. So it's possible that she could pass Louis XIV. Louis XIV is currently the longest reigning monarch, not just in European history, but I think in history, a little bit over 72 years. So it's possible if she lives another 3 years or so, she could pass, Louis XIV. So that is possible, about that. But Louis XIV is obviously, much powerful ruler. That's her when she was young, of course. Elizabeth, that's her with Prince Philip, who recently died, by the way. So I guess when she took power, 1952. Now, there's, of course, a question about what's going to happen, of course, when she dies. Obviously, Prince Charles, I guess, if he's still living, he would get the throne, of course, next. There is talk about maybe skipping him, maybe, obviously he would step down and maybe let his son reign instead, who might put some young blood into it, I guess. William, the Duke of Cambridge, like everybody has heard of, his children. So that's quite a possibility that they could do that, but we'll have to see what happens. I know some of you even talk about getting rid of the monarchy, like why do we have a monarchy for, that kind of thing, the 21st century. But anyway, I think it's great for their tourism. it's one of the biggest attractions that the British have. Is the monarchy. People, going to visit the palaces and things like that. And so it is still part of Britain. It's just that the monarchs are not really, truthfully, really, they're more like figureheads, I guess, today, the monarchs. They still sign off on, legislation and things like that, like a president does, things like that. They do have certain powers, but it's definitely not like a president. The president has a lot more power, like the United States, than compared to, say, like a constitutional monarch and all that. So anyway, but that's kind of my history, of course, of the rise of the British Empire. I didn't really go as much into, like, say, 19th, 20th century, of course, British history. We'll get more into that later. We get more closer to like the 19th century and all that. Kind of more went into like the 16th up to like the 18th century more than anything with that. But I don't think we have any comments, questions, of course, looks like today. But if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, please let me know, of course, on my channel. Of course, anytime you can, of course, leave me comments, questions if you want. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can also, of course, hit the subscribe button as well. Now, later in the week, I'm going to, of course, be moving on. I'm going to be talking about the Age of Enlightenment. I will kind of delve into talking about the scientific revolution as well, because that's one of the things that really kind of, I guess they say, influences the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason. So that's my next topic we'll get into. And then next week, I think I'm going to, of course, also move on to talk about the French Revolutionary period. So that kind of affects Europe also as well. So that's it pretty much for today. But don't forget, like, about those assignments I told you about at the beginning of the lecture broadcast that y'all got out there. I will kind of extend that first exam, but we will have a quiz on this, of course, lecture series that I've got posted, of course, today. You'll see it announcements. So that's it. I hope y'all had a great weekend overall. Like I said, we're more than halfway, of course, through the semester. So y'all take care, and I'll see you, of course, later in the week. So y'all take care.